In the spring of 1869, the town of Mercy, Louisiana was abuzz with excitement over the opening of the new Mercy Clinic. Nestled in the heart of town, its walls gleamed with the pristine promise of health and recovery, a stark contrast to the dark history of the region. Dr. Henry Montague, the clinic's founder and lead physician, was a man of impeccable reputation. His demeanor was soft-spoken, his smile warm and assuring. To the townsfolk, he was a savior, a man of science who would usher them into a new age of medical miracles. His success was inevitable. But behind the polished exterior of his pristine clinic, there was something else. Something dark and unspoken that no one could see. In those first few months, his patients spoke of him only in reverent tones, praising his skill, his unhurried manner, and his willingness to take on even the most difficult cases. What they did not see, what no one could yet fathom, was the monstrosity he had quietly begun to weave into the very fabric of Mercy's future. The first signs came quietly, imperceptibly, yet they sent a ripple of unease through the clinic's sterile halls. A young mother on the brink of giving birth arrived late one evening under Dr. Montague's care. Her pregnancy had been difficult, and the journey to the clinic had nearly killed her. She was desperate for help, her face twisted with fear and exhaustion, but Montague reassured her, his voice soothing as he prepared for the birth. When the child was born, all seemed well at first. Yet as the nurses cleaned the baby, something caught their eye. A strange mark, faint but unmistakable, etched into the infant's skin. The symbol was unlike anything the nurses had seen before, not a birthmark, but a deliberate design. Intricate, almost like a brand. The nurses exchanged nervous glances, but Montague, ever the composed professional, dismissed it with a smile, explaining it away as a rare condition, nothing to worry about. The infant, though weak from birth, was perfectly healthy otherwise. The moment passed, and the nurses, unsettled but unwilling to question their esteemed doctor, went on with their duties. Weeks passed, and the mark, though inexplicable, was soon forgotten, overshadowed by the clinic's growing success. Dr. Montague continued to bring in new patients, each one more desperate than the last. The clinic flourished, its reputation swelling with every new life saved, every new cure discovered. But the mark appeared again and again. Another infant, another birth, and yet another strange, subtle symbol, this time on a girl born under similar circumstances. The same faint mark and an intricate swirl of lines, almost like an ancient sigil, branded the child's skin. The whispers began to spread among the staff, but Dr. Montague, ever the calm leader, quickly silenced any concern with smooth words and practiced charm. He told the nurses it was a rare form of birth defect, something only he could diagnose, something he had seen only once before in his travels. There was no cause for alarm, he assured them. But as the days passed, the marks began to appear with increasing frequency, each one a reflection of something deeper, something hidden. Each time Montague's explanations grew more strained, his eyes betraying a flicker of something else, a quiet, unyielding confidence that no one dared challenge. Soon the marks were no longer isolated incidents. Every newborn who came under Montague's care bore the same strange, delicate symbol. As the marks multiplied, so too did the questions, though no one dared to ask them aloud. The clinic's success overshadowed everything, and soon the town's admiration for Montague reached a fever pitch. There were no fatalities in the clinic, no complications, no evidence that anything was wrong. The clinic was a model of efficiency, and Montague was a genius. The truth, however, lay in the quiet shadows. A darkness lurked just beneath the surface of the clinic's shining reputation. The mark, the symbol, was no coincidence. It was part of a grand design, a secret pact that Montague had made years before opening the clinic, a pact that would demand much more than anyone could imagine. The first death would come soon, but for now the town of Mercy remained blissfully unaware of the horrors being crafted within the clinic's walls. Montague's cold genius was already at work, threading his legacy of suffering into the future of the town. The mark, though mysterious, was not an anomaly. It was a warning, one that would soon be impossible to ignore. The clinic's growth continued, its success undeniable. More women came from far and wide, desperate for the renowned care that Dr. Montague offered, while Mercy itself seemed to bask in the glow of the clinic's newfound prosperity. Dr. Montague was everywhere, his soft-spoken authority so reassuring that no one dared to question the whispers that began to swirl in the corners of the clinic's pristine walls. As the weeks passed, something even more sinister began to unfold. Each newborn that passed through the clinic's doors carried the same strange mark. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence, a random anomaly. A birth defect, perhaps, or some genetic oddity. But soon the pattern became undeniable. One after another, each infant bore the same faint symbol, an intricate design resembling an ancient rune, a symbol so subtle it could easily be overlooked, but once seen, impossible to ignore. Charlotte, a young nurse with a sharp mind and a heart too full of empathy for the horrors she witnessed daily, began to notice the connection between these strange births and the increasing number of mothers who died under Dr. Montague's care. At first, the deaths were explained away by complications or old age. But as more mothers died in seemingly unrelated circumstances, Charlotte began to wonder if there was something more at play. She began to ask questions, but her inquiries were met with silence. Dr. Montague, as always, exuded a calm and reassuring presence, silencing the doubts of those around him with his smooth words. He warned the nurses, especially Charlotte, to keep their concerns to themselves. His explanations were always reasonable, always convincing. "These are rare complications," he would say. "Trust me, I've seen it before. Nothing to worry about." But Charlotte's unease grew. There was no doubt in her mind that something was terribly wrong. She started to investigate, quietly at first, observing patterns in the deaths and the strange symbol that marked each child. She couldn't help but notice the correlation between the mothers who died and the infants who survived, all marked with that same symbol, their tiny bodies forever branded. She found herself drawn to these children, feeling a strange, unspoken bond with them, as if they were victims too, innocent lives caught in the web of something far darker than anyone dared to believe. As Charlotte ventured deeper into the forbidden corners of the clinic, her unease grew. She found herself wandering the long, dimly lit hallways at night, her footsteps echoing in the silence, seeking answers that no one was willing to provide. The deeper she delved into the clinic's history, the more disturbing the truth became. There were whispers of ancient practices, of rituals tied to the symbol that appeared on the baby's skin. She uncovered documents that spoke of rites performed in secret, of sacrifices made in the name of some greater power. The walls of the clinic, it seemed, held secrets of their own, secrets that had been buried for years, hidden behind layers of success and trust. It was then that Charlotte stumbled upon the most chilling discovery. A hidden room deep within the clinic, a room that had been kept locked at all costs. It was a small, cold chamber, its air thick with the scent of something stale and forgotten. In the center of the room she found an altar, its surface stained with dark, dried marks that looked disturbingly like blood. The walls were adorned with faded symbols, the same ones that appeared on the infant's skin. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though it had been used for something unspeakable. Charlotte's heart raced as she realized the horrifying truth. The clinic and Dr. Montague were not what they appeared to be. The deaths, the strange marks, the sacrifices, they were all part of a larger, more twisted plan. Dr. Montague's clinic was not just a place of healing. It was a place of ritual, a place where lives were manipulated, broken, and ultimately sacrificed for some dark, unknown purpose. The mothers who died, the infants who were marked, they were all part of a sickening game, a game that Montague had been playing for years, and Charlotte had unwittingly become a part of. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had known there was something wrong, but the depth of the evil that had festered beneath the clinic's pristine surface was beyond anything she could have imagined. Charlotte was now trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The clinic had become her prison, and Dr. Montague, with his calm demeanor and false assurances, was the warden. She was alone, surrounded by a system of lies, manipulation, and death. And with every step she took to uncover the truth, the more she felt the weight of Montague's control tightening around her, pulling her deeper into his world of silent cruelty. The clinic that had once promised hope now seemed like a tomb, a place where the innocent were marked, manipulated, and discarded without a second thought. Charlotte could feel herself slipping, but there was no turning back. She had uncovered something far too dangerous, something that could never be unseen, and now the only thing left was survival. In the still, hushed silence of Dr. Montague's private office, Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as her fingers brushed over the weathered edges of an old journal tucked away in a hidden compartment of the doctor's desk. She had come here countless times before, cleaning, organizing, and rearranging the clutter, but today felt different. The room, usually so pristine, was now suffocating. The weight of her discoveries pressing down on her like the very walls were closing in. She couldn't explain why she felt compelled to look deeper, to pry into the private life of the man she had once trusted. But the signs had been growing too obvious to ignore. The marks on the infants, the strange deaths, the whispers in the hallways. All of it now felt like part of a larger, more terrifying picture. As her eyes skimmed over the journal's yellowed pages, the truth began to unfurl, each word more chilling than the last. The journal belonged to Dr. Montague, written in his neat, precise hand, and it spoke not of cures or treatments, but of something far darker. The entries were dated back decades, long before the clinic had opened. They told of a practice so ancient, so twisted, that it defied understanding. Montague had stumbled upon it while traveling, he claimed, a forgotten tradition buried in the ruins of an old, remote village. It was a ritual, one that involved the exchange of life the lives of the innocent, the lives of the purest. A ritual where the suffering of others, their pain and torment, became the price for power, for immortality. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she read on, each passage revealing more about the dark vow Montague had sworn to uphold. The mark on the infants was not a birth defect, as he had so often claimed. It was a symbol, a brand that linked them to something far older, far more sinister. The babies were not mere patients. They were sacrifices, the unwitting victims of a deal Montague had made with a hidden centuries-old cult. The ritual required the suffering of mothers, the brutal loss of life, pain that would feed the ritual, binding the infants to an ancient pact that Montague was bound to fulfill. Charlotte's mind reeled as she pieced together the grim truth. The doctor was not simply experimenting with his patients. He was feeding them into a cycle of ritualistic cruelty, a cycle that had started long before the clinic ever existed. The deaths, the pain, the marks on the babies, all of it was part of Montague's twisted design. He wasn't just healing the sick, he was orchestrating their destruction. Each life he saved was another step closer to fulfilling the dark promises he had made. His medical expertise, his charm, his reputation, they were all tools, carefully crafted to manipulate the very people who trusted him the most. The mothers who came to him desperate and hopeful were unknowingly walking into a trap. They had been chosen not for their health, but for their vulnerability, their innocence. Their suffering would fuel the ritual, and the babies born under Montague's care would carry the burden of that sacrifice, their marks the symbol of their bondage. Charlotte closed the journal, her heart racing in her chest. The weight of the knowledge she now held was unbearable. Dr. Montague was not the man she had believed him to be. He was a monster, a puppet master pulling the strings of fate, manipulating the lives of those around him with cold, calculated precision. His cruelty was not just scientific, it was spiritual, a twisted religion built on the suffering of the innocent. She wanted to scream, to shout at the injustice of it all. But no sound escaped her lips. She was trapped in his world now, and the truth she had uncovered would be her prison. Montague had always been 2 steps ahead, his mind calculating, his actions methodical. He knew what he was doing. Every move, every word, every decision had been carefully orchestrated. But what terrified Charlotte the most was not the man himself. It was the realization that she had been complicit. She had been part of the system, part of the very machinery that allowed Montague to carry out his horrific experiments. She had helped bring the babies into the world, helped him build his empire of lies. And now, there was no turning back. The clinic, the lives, the deaths, they were all part of the same horrifying plan. The mark on the infants was not just a symbol. It was a brand, a mark of ownership. They were no longer human in Montague's eyes. They were tools, sacrifices, pieces to be moved in his sickening game. As Charlotte sat there, the journal heavy in her lap, she realized the true depth of Montague's power. It was not just in his knowledge, his skill, or his reputation. His power lay in the way he manipulated the hearts and minds of those around him, the way he twisted their trust into something far more dangerous. He had already begun to warp the clinic's very soul, and now Charlotte was caught in his web. She knew there was only one way out: to expose him, to tear down the monstrous empire he had built. But as the words of the journal echoed in her mind, she realized that no one would believe her. They would never see Montague for the monster he truly was. The ritual was too old, too ingrained, and he was too powerful. She was alone, and time was running out. The darkness that had been lurking in the shadows of the clinic was now out in the open, and there was no telling how far Montague would go to protect his secret. Charlotte had no choice but to play his game, to survive long enough to find a way to stop him. But deep down, she knew the cost of that survival. It would cost more than she could ever imagine. Charlotte stood in Dr. Montague's office, the walls that had once felt so reassuring now closing in on her. The truth she had uncovered gnawed at her, but she had to hear it from him, hear him admit what she already feared. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling, yet her voice was steady as she spoke the words she knew she must say. "I know what you've been doing," she whispered, her gaze fixed on him. Montague looked up from his desk, his eyes cold and calculating, yet there was no surprise in his expression, no remorse, only the quiet recognition of someone who had been expecting this moment. He set down the papers he had been reading, his fingers lingering for a moment before folding his hands neatly on the desk as though in deliberate composure. "Do you?" he replied, his voice smooth, almost soothing, as if the knowledge of his monstrous acts was of no consequence to him. "What do you think I've been doing, Charlotte?" His calmness was maddening, his indifference to the suffering he had caused impossible to comprehend. Charlotte's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "The mothers, they're dying because of you. The babies, they're all marked." His lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for her to come to this inevitable conclusion. "Yes, they are," he said softly. "You've done well to figure it out, Charlotte, but you must understand it was never random. It was never an accident." Charlotte's mind reeled, but she couldn't turn away, couldn't tear her gaze from the man who had, until now, seemed nothing more than a kind, competent doctor. She had believed in him. She had trusted him. But now, she saw the monster for what he was. "It was planned?" she whispered, her voice cracking with the weight of the revelation. "All of it?" Montague leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes," he replied, the word carrying a dark finality. "This clinic, these women, these children, they are all part of something much larger than you could ever understand. My work is not simply about curing the sick. It's about continuing a legacy." His words were so matter-of-fact, so devoid of any remorse, that Charlotte's mind struggled to process the reality of what he was saying. "A legacy? Of what?" "A legacy of what?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Montague's smile deepened, his eyes gleaming with a hidden knowledge that chilled her to the bone. "A legacy that has been passed down for centuries," he explained, his tone almost reverent. "The death of the mothers, their sacrifice, was necessary for the success of the ritual. The pain they suffered was the price for something greater." Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as the words sank in. "The ritual," she repeated, as if saying the words would somehow make sense of them. "What ritual?" Montague leaned forward, his hands clasped before him in a manner that was almost prayerful. "The ritual of life and death," he said softly. "The pain and death of the mothers were sacrifices necessary to ensure the survival of the powerful figures who back me. The blood of the innocent feeds the ritual, Charlotte. It grants power, grants eternal life to those who deserve it. The mark on the children, the suffering of their mothers, all of it is part of the design. The words rang in Charlotte's ears, but she couldn't make sense of them. The idea that these women had died for something so insidious, so cold and methodical, felt like a knife being twisted in her gut. She had been complicit. She had helped bring these women into Montague's clinic, believing in his cause, trusting in his promises. And now the truth was too much to bear. You ... her voice faltered. You killed them. All of them. For what? For power? Montague didn't flinch, didn't blink at the accusation. His expression remained eerily calm, as if the weight of the truth did not burden him in the slightest. Power, he repeated, as if the word had no true meaning. Yes, power. But more than that, it is about control. Control over life and death. Control over fate itself. The suffering of these women, the sacrifice they gave, it is a small price to pay for immortality. Charlotte stumbled backward, her mind spinning. The realization of what Montague had done, what he had manipulated her into, was overwhelming. She had been nothing more than a tool in his sickening game. He had used her trust, her belief in his goodness to carry out his twisted designs. He had manipulated her innocence to further his own dark agenda. Montague stood, his chair scraping across the floor with an almost ceremonial finality. "Charlotte," he said softly, his voice now laced with something colder, more detached. "You have seen the truth. There is no going back now. You understand, don't you? This is not just my work. This is the work of those who have come before me, those who have shaped history from the shadows, and you, Charlotte, are now part of that history." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear everything apart, but the weight of his words held her in place. She was part of something far darker than she could have ever imagined. She had been a witness to the worst kind of evil, one that had been hidden in plain sight. "The blood of the innocent," Montague murmured, his eyes narrowing as if he were seeing something beyond her. "It is a powerful thing. And it will continue, Charlotte. It always will." His words echoed in her mind long after he had spoken them, reverberating through the walls of the clinic, through her own soul. The blood of the innocent. It would continue, and she was powerless to stop it. As the ritual progressed, Dr. Montague's influence began to spread like an insidious virus, quietly weaving its way through the fabric of mercy. The clinic, once a symbol of hope and healing, had transformed into a dark force in the town's life, a malignant shadow hanging over every home, every corner. The more people trusted him, the stronger his grip became, until even the very air of mercy felt heavy with dread. Those who had once praised him, those who had once seen him as a savior, began to fall under his spell. Montague's patients were no longer just patients. They were pawns in his larger game, part of a grand design that stretched far beyond his clinic's walls. Each one was a cog in the machine, their suffering and survival dictated by his will. Their lives serving a purpose in the ritual that was nearing its completion. The clinic's success, the cures it promised, the lives it seemed to save, it was all a smokescreen. Underneath, Montague was playing a far darker game, one that only a few could truly understand. And those few who dared to question him, those who saw the truth or suspected something was wrong, disappeared without a trace. The town of Mercy, already gripped by fear and superstition, was slowly poisoned by Montague's practices. People started to vanish. The town's children, its mothers, its elders, disappearing into the shadows, their fates unknown, their deaths quietly erased from the records. Those who dared to challenge Montague, those who spoke out or asked too many questions, were swiftly dealt with. Their deaths were made to look like accidents, tragic misfortunes that no one could have predicted. But Charlotte knew better. She had seen too much, learned too much to ignore the truth any longer. She could feel the cold hand of fear tightening around her heart. But it was not just fear that kept her moving. It was a desperate need to understand, to find out what lay at the heart of Montague's madness, to uncover the depths of the corruption he had sown in Mercy. It was this pursuit that led her to the hidden chamber. She had heard rumors, hushed whispers among the staff, of a secret room deep within the clinic, a room that no one was allowed to enter. The door was always locked, always guarded, and no one spoke of it. But Charlotte could no longer ignore the nagging sense that something terrible was hidden there. One evening, when the clinic was eerily quiet, she found the key. It was hidden in a drawer in Montague's desk, tucked beneath papers she had long ago grown accustomed to sorting. Her heart pounded in her chest as she held it in her hand, knowing that it was the key to something far darker than she could imagine. She crept through the hallways, her footsteps barely making a sound against the cold stone floors. She reached the door, the key fitting into the lock with a quiet click. The door opened slowly, creaking on its hinges as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Inside, the room was cold, musty, the air thick with the scent of something old, something forgotten. And there, in the center of the room, she saw them, the bodies, the faces, frozen in terror. Women and children, their lifeless eyes staring blankly ahead, their faces contorted in the final moments of agony. Their bodies were arranged in a macabre tableau as if placed there deliberately, each one positioned with the care of an artist arranging a grotesque masterpiece. The horror of what she saw twisted in Charlotte's stomach, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch one of the bodies. She recoiled, horrified by the coldness of the flesh, the unnatural stillness of it. These were not accidents. These were not victims of the clinic's supposed treatments. These were sacrifices. She could feel it in her bones. The women, the children, they had been part of Montague's ritual, part of the dark promise he had made so many years ago. They were the price of power, of immortality, of whatever twisted vision Montague was hell-bent on fulfilling. They were the blood that fueled the ritual, the innocent lives given to feed the machine that Montague had created. Charlotte's mind reeled as she stumbled back from the bodies, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. How had she not seen it? How had she been so blind to the truth? The deaths of the mothers, the suffering of the babies. It had all been part of a larger plan, a plan to manipulate the very fabric of life and death, to control fate itself. And she had been complicit. She had helped Montague, had trusted him, had believed in his lies. Now she could no longer deny the truth. Montague was no healer. He was a monster. A cold, calculating predator who had used his knowledge, his charm, to manipulate an entire town into believing he was a savior. But behind his mask of innocence there was only darkness. Charlotte stood in the room, the weight of the truth crushing her, as the reality of what she had uncovered set in. Montague was no longer just a man, he was a force. a system of evil that had infiltrated every corner of Mercy, that had poisoned the very air they breathed. And now Charlotte knew she had no choice but to confront him. But the fear that gripped her was not just of Montague's power. It was of the system he had built, the countless lives he had manipulated, the innocent souls he had sacrificed to further his own goals. She was up against something far bigger than just a madman. She was up against an entire institution of evil, one that had taken root in Mercy long before she had ever arrived. The town, the clinic, the lives of those who had disappeared. They were all part of Montague's game, and the price of that game was far more than anyone had ever imagined. As the days wore on, Charlotte could feel the weight of Montague's presence closing in on her, suffocating her every step. The clinic, which had once felt like a place of healing, now felt like a tomb, a place of twisted rituals and buried secrets. The final step of Montague's ritual was near, and Charlotte knew it all too well. She had uncovered enough of his plans to understand what was coming. The mark on the infants, the suffering of the mothers, the hidden bodies. It had all led to this moment, the final sacrifice. The thought alone made her stomach churn with dread. It was going to happen. The baby chosen for the sacrifice would be one of their own, an innocent life plucked from the clinic's swaddled patients. A final offering to the dark powers Montague had sworn allegiance to. It was inevitable. Charlotte had tried to warn herself, tried to distance herself from the horrific reality, but she knew she was too late. Montague had orchestrated this for far too long, and now the time had come. The child had already been selected, its fate sealed before its birth. The last piece of the puzzle would fall into place, completing the twisted vision Montague had been building for years. Charlotte had to do something. She couldn't just stand by and let it happen. She couldn't let this innocent child die. She had seen enough, heard enough to know the depths of Montague's depravity. She had to act. Desperation flooded her veins as she looked around the clinic, searching for any way out. The child was in a room down the hall, lying in its cradle, unaware of the fate that awaited it. Charlotte's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door, the key to the room heavy in her trembling hand. She could hear the faint sound of Montague's voice in the distance, his smooth, controlled tone issuing orders to his followers, preparing for the final act. She opened the door as quietly as possible, her breath catching in her throat as she looked at the baby lying in the crib. The child was small, innocent, and yet the world had already decided its fate. Charlotte's hands shook as she carefully lifted the child from the cradle, cradling it in her arms as though it were the most fragile thing in the world. The baby's soft cries filled her ears, and her heart broke with every sob. It was her fault, she thought. She had allowed this to happen. She had been a part of the system, part of the lies, part of the ritual. But now she had a chance to make it right. She would take the child and leave, run far away from the clinic, from Montague, from the hell that had become her life. But as she turned to leave, the door slammed open and she froze. A figure stood in the doorway, one of Montague's followers, his eyes cold, his expression devoid of any emotion. Behind him stood another and another, their faces impassive as they slowly advanced toward her. Charlotte's pulse quickened as the reality of her situation hit her like a slap to the face. She was trapped. There was nowhere to go. The town's elite, the people who had once hailed Montague as a savior, had now become his loyal cult followers. They had infiltrated every part of Mercy, their influence stretching into every corner of the town. They were the ones who had ensured Montague's power, who had helped him cover his tracks, who had protected his twisted plans from the world. And now, they had come for her. "You cannot run, Charlotte," the man said, his voice low and unwavering. "It's already done." Charlotte backed away, clutching the child tightly to her chest, her eyes searching for any escape. But there was no hope. The walls had closed in on her, and there was no way out. The followers advanced, their eyes unblinking, their movements deliberate. Montague had known what she would do. He had known she would try to escape with the child, and he had made sure she would fail. This was all part of the plan. She was no longer in control. The cult members circled her, blocking any attempt she might make to flee. Charlotte's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let them take the child. She couldn't let the ritual be completed. But Montague's followers were relentless. They closed in, and the air grew thick with the stench of inevitability. Charlotte was no longer in control of her fate. Montague had planned this moment from the very beginning, and now it was time for the final act. "You have no choice," one of the cult members said, his voice devoid of compassion. "It's either you or the child." The words hit her like a knife to the gut. She had never imagined she would be forced into such a decision, but here she was, standing at the crossroads of morality and survival. The child, or herself, the cost of silence, the price of not speaking out sooner. Charlotte's thoughts churned, but there was no time to dwell on the weight of her decision. The followers moved closer, their hands reaching out to take the child. Her grip tightened on the infant. Her heart screamed for mercy. In a moment of agony, she made her choice. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't let you." And in that instant, she made the only decision she could. With a desperate surge of strength, Charlotte turned and ran toward the door. The cult members lunged at her, but she was faster, her feet pounding the floor as she made for the clinic's back exit. The sound of their pursuit echoed in her ears, but she refused to stop. The baby's cries filled her mind, pushing her forward. She had made her choice. She would protect this child, whatever it cost her, whatever it meant for her future. She would not allow Montague's ritual to be completed. But as she reached the door, she knew deep in her heart that she had crossed a line. There would be no going back. Montague's power had already taken root in Mercy, and Charlotte knew she would never escape the darkness that had consumed them all. The final steps of Montague's ritual were behind him, but its aftermath lingered like a dark stain across the very fabric of Mercy. The mark, which had once been so prominent on the newborn's skin, had faded with the completion of the ritual. But its absence did nothing to alleviate the tension that gripped Charlotte's heart. The mark's disappearance only deepened the horror she had come to understand. The babies, the mothers, the suffering, all of it had been a means to an end. An unholy price paid for power, for immortality, for control over the very essence of life and death. Montague was dead, but his shadow still loomed large. Charlotte had done what she could. She had exposed him. She had revealed the monstrous truth to the world, peeling back the layers of lies that had concealed Montague's horrors for so long. The evidence was irrefutable. the bodies, the journals, the testimonies from those who had survived. It all pointed to one man. Dr. Henry Montague, the man who had promised salvation, had instead delivered destruction. His twisted legacy was now out in the open, but the revelation of his crimes had not brought the justice she had so desperately hoped for. Instead, it had unleashed a new battle, one far more insidious than she could have ever imagined. The state, the very institutions that Montague had wormed his way into, were not so easily swayed. His supporters, entrenched in the political and social structures of Mercy and beyond, rallied to protect his memory, to preserve the legacy he had built. They were powerful, untouchable, and they had no intention of letting a few exposed truths bring down everything Montague had spent years constructing. Charlotte, though emboldened by the truth, now found herself fighting an unseen enemy, one that operated in the shadows. Montague's death had been a blow to his followers, but it had not destroyed them. They moved like ghosts in the night, manipulating the system, protecting their own, and making sure that Montague's vision did not die with him. The town of Mercy, still reeling from the horror of what had been exposed, was left divided. There were those who believed Charlotte, who knew the truth of Montague's evil and mourned the lives lost to his ritual. But there were just as many who refused to accept what had happened, who dismissed the evidence as lies, as the ramblings of a broken woman unable to grasp the brilliance of Montague's work. They clung to the narrative that Montague had been a genius, a misunderstood healer who had simply been ahead of his time. It was easier to believe that than to confront the gruesome reality that Charlotte had uncovered. She could feel the weight of their denial, pressing down on her, the very air of Mercy thick with the stench of corruption. The trial, if it could even be called that, had been a mockery. Montague's loyalists had managed to keep the most damning evidence hidden, using their influence to manipulate the outcome. The death of Montague had been a blip in the system, a momentary disruption, but the machine that he had built was still running, still moving forward. It was like trying to fight a shadow. Montague's influence stretched far beyond the clinic, beyond the town of Mercy. His cult-like following had seeped into every corner of society, and no matter how hard Charlotte tried to expose the truth, it was always silenced, dismissed, ignored. Charlotte had thought that once Montague was gone, the battle would be over, but in truth it had only just begun. She had become a symbol, the woman who had dared to speak the truth, and for that she had become a target. Her life was no longer her own. The powers that Montague had left behind were too entrenched, too powerful to be taken down by one person. They didn't care about the suffering, the loss of innocent lives, the ritual that had claimed so many souls. They cared about maintaining control, about keeping the system intact. The world that Montague had built was far from destroyed. It had simply adapted, evolved, and found new ways to survive. Charlotte's pursuit of justice had put a target on her back, and she now found herself at the mercy of a system that had no intention of allowing the truth to take hold. In the quiet of the night, Charlotte would lie awake, the echoes of Montague's voice in her mind reminding her that the cost of truth was never free. It was a heavy burden, one that she had chosen to bear, but one that would weigh on her soul for the rest of her life. Every day she fought the system that had allowed Montague's crimes to flourish, but every day she saw how deep the corruption ran, how insurmountable the task had become. The town of Mercy may have known the truth, but Montague's legacy had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of their lives that it would take more than one person to undo the damage. Charlotte had thought that exposing the evil would bring the light, but now she understood that the darkness didn't just linger in the corners. It was a part of the system, a system that had been built on secrets, on manipulation, on ritualistic cruelty. And as long as that system remained intact, Montague's evil would never truly die. It would live on, a shadow haunting the town, an unseen hand guiding its every movement. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. And Charlotte, alone in the face of it all, had to decide how much more she was willing to sacrifice to make sure the truth was never buried again. The town of Mercy never truly recovered. After Montague's death and the exposure of his horrific crimes, the air around the once thriving clinic grew thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very soil of the town bore the weight of its dark history. Charlotte had done what she could. She had fought, exposed the truth, and seen the foundations of Montague's empire crumble. In the wake of the revelations, new laws were passed, laws that aimed to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. But these were merely symbols of progress enacted in the name of justice, while the town's wounds remained deep and festering. The clinic, its walls now abandoned and hollow, was a permanent reminder of the horrors that had been committed within. And while the law may have tried to heal the town, it did nothing to erase the memories that clung to its people like a sickness. The monument in the town square stood as a solemn tribute to the victims of Montague's cruelty, a stone reminder of the lives lost, the innocence shattered. But no matter how many names were etched into that memorial, no matter how much time passed, it could never wash away the fear, the helplessness that had taken root in the hearts of the townspeople. Charlotte, too, had become a shadow of the woman she once was. She had once believed in the righteousness of exposing evil, of bringing the truth to light. But now, as she walked the empty streets of Mercy, she felt like a ghost, a lingering presence in a town that had been forever altered by the very evil she had hoped to vanquish. The new laws, the memorial, the hushed whispers of Montague's name, none of it brought her peace. It only served to remind her of the cost of progress. The system had changed, but the scars it left on the town's psyche could never be undone. The people of Mercy went on with their lives as they always had, but the town was no longer the same. The clinic, once a place of hope, had become a symbol of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of society. The fear Montague had instilled in the people still hung in the air, an invisible weight that pressed down on everyone. The townsfolk avoided speaking of the clinic, of Montague, of the horrors that had unfolded there. They whispered in the shadows behind closed doors, but the truth was too much to bear. Too many had been complicit, too many had turned a blind eye, and now the town was left to live with the consequences of their silence. Charlotte found herself retreating into herself. She had done what she could, but the cost of exposing Montague's crimes had been far greater than she had anticipated. The victory was hollow. She had wanted to rid the world of Montague's evil, but in doing so she had uncovered something far more insidious. The way evil could spread, how it could infiltrate not just an institution but an entire town. It was the aftermath that haunted her. She could never shake the image of those innocent lives, the bodies she had discovered in that hidden chamber, the faces frozen in terror. She had been part of something larger, something that had gone far beyond the clinic and Montague's twisted rituals. She had uncovered the darkness that lived in the very heart of the town, and she could never forget it. As she walked through the streets, she saw the lingering fear in the eyes of the people. The new laws had been passed, but there was no real closure. Montague's legacy was still alive, not in the memory of the man himself, but in the silence of the town, in the unspoken fear that had taken root in the very soul of Mercy. The truth had been exposed, but it had not healed anything. It had only made the scars more visible. Charlotte had hoped for a reckoning, for some semblance of justice, but what she found instead was a town that had buried its pain, that had refused to acknowledge the evil that had taken root within it. She had thought that the exposure of Montague's crimes would bring peace, but in the end, it only revealed the depth of the rot. Mercy, like Charlotte herself, was forever changed. The new laws, the memorial, the empty clinic, they were all monuments to a past that could never be erased. The fear, the guilt, the complicity, they remained in the blood of the town, in its very structure. Montague's death had not been the end. It had been the beginning of a far more insidious transformation, a transformation that would haunt Mercy for generations. Charlotte stood before the memorial, her eyes scanning the names etched into the stone, the faces of the lost souls forever captured in time. She had done what she could, but the cost of truth was more than she had ever imagined. The world had changed, but the scars of Montague's reign would never fade. They were embedded in the very soul of Mercy, a legacy of darkness that no amount of law or monuments could ever remove. As the wind whispered through the town, Charlotte knew the truth. The evil Montague had set in motion had not been undone. It had merely been buried beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment of weakness to rise again. And there was no escaping it. In the stillness of the night, Charlotte sat alone in the clinic, now long abandoned, its walls empty of the life and vitality they once held. The echoes of its past whispered in the air, a chilling reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Montague's death had not brought closure, not for her, and certainly not for the town of Mercy. The pain, the suffering, the twisted rituals, all of it had left scars too deep to heal. And though the clinic was no longer in operation, the legacy of what had happened there lingered like a shadow across the town. She had fought for the truth, had brought Montague's atrocities to light, but in the end, all she had achieved was the exposure of evil, not its eradication. The legacy of Montague's reign was not one of justice or healing, but one of silence, one of complicity. The people of Mercy, though they had learned the truth, had not truly been freed. The darkness Montague had planted had taken root so deeply that it could not be easily uprooted. The people still walked the same streets, went about their daily lives, pretending that the horrors of the past could be buried with the ashes of the clinic. But Charlotte knew better. The evil that had thrived there was not something that could be erased by the passing of time, not something that could be washed away with the passage of a few laws or the construction of a memorial. It was a sickness, one that had spread far beyond Montague and his twisted cult. It was a sickness that had infected the very heart of Mercy, the minds of its people. Montague had been the face of that evil, but he was not the cause. He was merely a symptom of a deeper rot, one that had festered in the shadows for years, perhaps even centuries. The power structures, the political corruption, the willingness to look the other way, all of these things had allowed Montague's madness to grow unchecked, to spread like wildfire through the town, claiming the lives of so many innocent victims. The darkness that Montague had embodied was not just his own. It was the collective darkness of a society that had chosen to ignore the signs, that had placed trust in the wrong hands, that had allowed a monster to wear the mask of a healer. And now, that darkness had been exposed, but it had not been destroyed. Charlotte had been the one to shine a light on it, to tear back the veil and reveal the truth. But in doing so, she had only opened the door to a much larger, more insidious question. Could this happen again? Could another Montague rise, cloaked in innocence, hidden behind the mask of legitimacy and respectability, deceiving an entire town? Charlotte's mind churned with the weight of this thought. How could she ever truly know? How could she or anyone be sure that they weren't still blind to the evil among them? Montague had been able to manipulate everyone around him, from the town's leaders to the most vulnerable of its people, and it had taken far too long for the truth to come to light. What if there was another one? Another monster waiting to slip through the cracks? What if there were others, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? She closed her eyes, feeling the cold grip of fear tighten in her chest. Montague had been a master of manipulation, a man who knew exactly how to play the system, how to exploit the weaknesses of those around him. He had hidden his cruelty beneath a facade of charity and healing, and for years no one had suspected a thing. The fact that it had taken so long for anyone to realize what was happening spoke to the extent of the sickness that had infected Mercy. How many more would be fooled? How many more would be sacrificed before anyone noticed? The thought was unbearable, yet Charlotte could not escape it. She had exposed Montague, but she had not removed the poison from the town. It was still there, still lurking in the undercurrents of Mercy's society, in its power structures, its institutions, its people. The clinic was gone, but the fear, the guilt, the complacency, those things remained. They could not be scrubbed away with new laws, with new monuments. The scars Montague had left on Mercy were too deep. They were buried in the very foundation of the town, in the way its people turned a blind eye to the suffering around them, in the way they refused to acknowledge the darkness that had always been there, waiting to be unleashed. As Charlotte stood there alone in the cold, empty clinic, she realized the bitter truth. The evil that had flourished under Montague's reign was not just his own. It was a reflection of something far deeper, something far more terrifying. It was the nature of humanity itself, the willingness to turn away, to ignore the suffering, to bury the truth for the sake of comfort, for the sake of order. And that was the most horrifying realization of all, that no matter how much time passed, No matter how many laws were passed, no matter how many memorials were built, the evil Montague had unleashed would always remain. It would be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time society chose to look away. "What do you think?" she asked the empty room, the words slipping from her lips like a whisper to the darkness. "Could this happen again? Are we truly able to see the evil that hides in plain sight? Or do we remain complicit in its growth?" The silence was deafening, and as Charlotte turned to leave the clinic for the final time, she understood that the answer to her question was not something she could answer alone. The fight against evil, against the darkness that lurked in the hearts of men, was not over. It had only just begun. And whether or not the world would ever truly see it depended on the willingness of those who knew the truth to stand against it.